Okay. We can do it, you guys. He's gonna do this forever unless I put him down. Okay, goodbye. Welcome back to another edition of Backlog Books, but on YouTube this time. My name is Kara. I normally do a podcast, but my parents really wanted me to read the third chapter of this book. So here we are again. To recap, this book is An Irresistible Impulse by Billy Douglas. It's great. It's a jury duty romance from 1983. What could possibly go wrong? I recommend generally watching the first 2 chapters of this if you want to understand what's going on. If you don't care, whatever. I don't care. I'm not your boss. Okay. I think that's a little better. And I lost my usual background tapestry, and I keep bumping this table. So instead, these are my friend Emmy's like cool fans that she does like cool fan dancing with. But she left them here, so here they are now. Great. Chapter 3 of An Irresistible Impulse. I'm going to just really quickly see how many pages there are in this chapter. Is this 25 pages again? Mad props to Billy Douglas for writing 25-page chapters over and over. Chapter 3. We just found out that Abby is in the room next to Ben, who is her significant eye contact partner so far. That's all they do. They make significant eye contact, and he, like, touches her cheek with the back of his hand. Chapter 3. Her pulse quickened. It was one thing to know that Ben's room was right next to hers, that each time she dressed or showered or climbed into bed, he'd be doing the same little more than a wall's width away. But to arrive in court and find that they'd be seated beside one another throughout the long trial process. How awful. You have to sit next to each other. Was something else. It, too, was the luck of the draw, her 12th to his 13th, and she had mixed feelings as to its merit. I was watching a video recently where somebody talked about, like, the third act drama in a romance, and I'm really wondering what that could possibly be in a jury duty romance. Is it that, like, jury duty's over, so now you don't have to hang out with each other all the time? I'm sort of holding out for her horrible boyfriend showing up and being like besties with Ben. There was, on the one hand, a certain solace at having him so close. While her own stomach nodded in anticipation of the start of the proceedings, he sat calmly, quietly, exuding a tranquility that gave her strength. On the other hand, though, there was the way he looked, all clean and fresh and startlingly vibrant. His shirt was crisp and white, his blazer a dignified navy, his slacks, ... his slacks, ... She knew them to be gray. Listen, it's in here twice, okay? Though her eye was more entranced by the way they spanned his thigh as he crossed one knee over the other. Whew, starting off already. All things considered, Abby wondered whether her stomach fluttered in response to the air of expectation in the courtroom, ... or in response to the stimulus of one thoroughly virile Benjamin Wyatt. I am not the intended audience for romance books. Everything okay, Abby? He asked softly. You look a little peaked. We didn't wear you out this morning, did we? The last was on a gently teasing note. They went on a run this morning. To be clear, during the run, he said she ran well for a girl. Ugh, worst man ever. Not on your life. She's said this before. The not on your life thing, she says that often. She countered, quickly rising to his bait with the shadow of a smile. I'm impressed that you guys kept up as well as you did. Good for you, girl. Then she glanced toward the crowd in the courtroom and her smile vanished. "It's this whole thing, I guess," she offered in explanation of her pallor. "I just wish we'd begin. It doesn't look like there's a free seat here." Ben joined her in scanning the packed courtroom. Only the defendants. They must be waiting. Ah, here he comes now. They'll probably explain this in a second. The case is against some senator's son who is accused of kidnapping and then holding his girlfriend hostage for a few weeks in a secluded cabin. So that's cool. A hush settled over the crowd as a door at the front of the courtroom opened and the defendant emerged, accompanied by 2 guards, both uniformed, both alert. Abby noted that Derek Bradley was impeccably dressed, conservative in a dark gray 3-piece suit and dark cordovans. We've made it 2 pages, and we've reached the part of the chapter where I start Googling everything. I'm assuming shoes. Cordovans are some kind of shoes. That's my guess. Let's see. So cordovan is a kind of soft leather made originally from goat skin and now from horsehide. But shell cordovan is a type of leather commonly used in high-end shoemaking. So it's like Oxfords and brogues. I'm not a shoe person. Dark cordovans. He was freshly shaven, well-groomed, and good-looking. When he offered a fleeting smile toward the front row where members of his family sat grouped together, Abby could see how many a woman might be charmed. "I'm surprised the prosecution didn't challenge your selection," Ben leaned sideways to whisper. "Derek Bradley is young and attractive, and if he smiles at you that way..." There is also another young and pretty girl on this jury. It's not just Abby. "Don't be absurd," she came back with a forceful whisper of her own. "He's not that good-looking. Besides, he can't be a day over 30. I like my men older, more mellow." Okay. They didn't, ask her romantic preferences when they were doing the jury selection, so... He arched a brow. "That's encouraging." Maybe the prosecution knew what it was doing after all. Either that, or they ran out of challenges. His eyes were warm as they studied her, and Abby felt her cheeks flush in response. Bugh. She was saved the need to answer him by the loud rap of a gavel to her left. "Please rise in honor of the court," the clerk of the court intoned loudly. Every soul in the courtroom stood. Abby gripped the wooden railing that separated the 2 rows of jurors and watched wide eyes as the judges appeared at a door to her right. Single file with black-robed Theodore Hammond in the middle, the 3 slowly mounted the bench. I don't know enough about criminal trials to know how many judges are supposed to serve on them. I'm going to guess this book is not like a good guide for jury trials. I could be wrong. What if in the future this book was the only evidence left of what our court system used to be like? And people 10,000 years from now had to use an irresistible impulse to figure out how courts in the United States worked. Wacky. "Be seated," the clerk directed. Every soul in the courtroom sat. And their bodies, too. Abby was only too glad to be off her feet again. Her knees had been none too steady, her palms none too dry, ... I'm just going to point out every ellipses I can. And Benjamin Wyeth had been far too tall and straight. I know that's not what she means, but it's still funny. By her side to ignore. At least now the arms of the brown leather chairs separated them. Jesus. Glancing down, she was caught by the contrast of her creamy silk sleeve against his of navy wool, her slimness against his muscled strength. A wave of primal sensitivity surged through her. So much for the saving grace of brown leather chairs, she mused in dismay as she diplomatically tucked in her elbows, folded her hands in her lap, and did her best to turn her attention to the court. primal sensitivity. The crowd stilled when the clerk stood to read the indictments, naming the defendant, Derek Bradley, on charges of kidnapping and assault and battery. At the arraignment months before, pleas of not guilty had been entered. Now the words re-echoed through the courtroom. Then, as Grace, who was one of their guards, had warned, the judge took several minutes to address the jury. Ladies and gentlemen. Oh, I'm sorry, this is the judge? I think this is Theo, whose voice I was doing very differently. Ladies and gentlemen, that's not it. I do declare. No, it's wrong. I'm going to spend 10 minutes trying to figure this out. I don't know that I can do this accent anymore. Ladies and gentlemen, he began gravely, you've been asked to make a sacrifice that many of your fellow citizens have never and will never be asked to make. For the sake of justice, you have agreed to surrender your freedom for the duration of this trial. The court recognizes the extent of this sacrifice and hereby thanks you on behalf of the state of Vermont. He can be from Georgia and be a judge in Vermont. Abby hung on his every word, as did each of her fellow jurors. Not one moved. Not one acknowledged the fact that the eyes of the courtroom were upon them. As this trial progresses, you will be presented with arguments and evidence by representatives of two opposing sides. We ask that you listen carefully to each and every point, since it will be your job to make a final decision as to the guilt or innocence of the defendant. He paused to frown at the papers on his desk before continuing. As you know, the purpose of sequestration is to prevent your being influenced one way or the other by outside forces. The only sources of input you are to have regarding this case are myself and my side judges, the prosecution team and its witnesses, and the defense team and its witnesses. You are neither to hear anything about this case from, nor discuss anything about this case with, any other person. Unfortunately, that includes each other. Difficult as it may be, I ask that you don't discuss this case among yourselves. When the time comes for deliberations, you will be able to do so, but only after each side has rested its case. If you have questions or problems of any sort, the court officers are at your service. Wherever possible, they'll try to minimize the inconvenience that this experience must be for you. Feel free to ask for their help. Looking first to one side and then the other, the judge silently asked his partners on the bench if they had anything to add. When 2 headshakes had been received, he nodded and turned to the prosecution table. Mr. Watts. The opening argument of the state's attorney lasted for nearly an hour. Can you take notes? I would be going crazy. It was offered in the low-key style that would come to be associated with David White's, but was as emotion-packed in content as its presentation was straight. The prosecutor began with the premise that Derek Bradley, in a cool and premeditated act, had kidnapped his former lover, Greta Robinson, with the intent of punishing her for spurning him and forcing a return of her affections. He went on to paint the defendant as a self-centered man, a man of inherited wealth, who had come to believe that his power was boundless, that his will was the law. He cited witnesses who would testify not only to the facts of the case, but to Derek Bradley's arrogance, his selfishness, his tyrannical personality, and he suggested that, after days of emotional torture in an isolated cabin, Greta Robinson was scarred for life. Yeah. Oh. Okay. Scarred for life. When he'd concluded his opening presentation, the judge called a 15-minute recess and disappeared with his colleagues into their chambers. The jury was led down to the first-floor jury room where coffee and donuts were served. He doesn't want to stay here for this. Why don't you like this? Not a romance book guy either? It's not his thing. Goodbye. Abby took a chair by herself, deep in thought, neither terribly thirsty nor particularly hungry. She was amazed at how simple he'd made Bradley's actions sound, how clear-cut, how wrong. Had a vote been held at that very minute, she would surely have found Derek Bradley guilty. But there was still another side to hear, she told herself, and this was just the opening argument. "I can't get you any coffee?" Ben asked, bending over her chair, his hand on its back. Startled from her thoughts, she looked up quickly. "Coffee? No thanks." It's good coffee. He tried temptation as he settled down beside her. Leaning forward with his elbows propped on his thighs, he's balanced his own cup between his palms. Abby smiled begrudgingly. I think I've got enough adrenaline surging through these veins to forego the caffeine. It's not good for you, you know. Caffeine does a job on the pancreas, among other things. Let me have my coffee, Abby. Ben shot her a glance as he took a deliberate sip from his cup. So they tell me, he murmured in amusement. Is the nurse a crusader? This is the woman speaking. Okay. And I'm certainly no crusader. She gave a pert shrug. What does that mean? Feel free to drink whatever you want. Then she paused to watch him swirl the cup, lift it to his lips, scowl, and lower it again without so much as a sip, and she stifled a smug grin. I'll bet you down plenty of that stuff when you're working to finish a manuscript. His gaze was enigmatic. A manuscript? She rubbed her forehead with her fingers. I keep coming up with China. Was that it? It was. Hearing the hesitation in his voice, Abby eyed him quizzically. You seem disturbed. Is something wrong? No, ... Not really. I'm just ... surprised. That book wasn't exactly a bestseller. Andre seemed to think it was great. Who's Andre? A friend. A fiancé-type friend? Blech, he asked, a bit of the old humor returning. Abby couldn't help but chuckle. No, a friend type of friend. He owns a bookstore, and I happened to be around when your books first arrived. I got the impression that they sold well. Oh boy, China's an in topic, he shrugged, but he'd straightened in his seat and was far from nonchalant. Don't tell me your book is a travelogue, she teased. No. He seemed hesitant to discuss it, though, somehow uncomfortable. Well, she prodded softly, allowing curiosity to get the better of her. Overcoming reticence, he spoke at last. It's an analysis of transitional politics in the People's Republic. China has fascinated me for years. Oh boy. When the opportunity to visit it finally came up, I knew that I'd have to write the book. It was as though he were excusing himself. Abby couldn't understand it. That's great, Ben. You must be proud of the book. Was it your first? First significant one, yes. Have you written others since? One other. Her eyes lit up. Finished? Uh-huh. There was something that wasn't being said. No kidding. This guy has been like nonstop chatterbox to Abby, and now he's like, he doesn't like to talk about himself, I guess. She could see it in the depths of his eyes, feel it in his quiet intensity. While she waited expectantly, he sat perfectly still. Suddenly, the wheels of her mind fell into gear and began to turn. Yesterday morning, here in the same jury room, they'd shared something none of the others had felt. It had been a mutually favorable bent toward serving on this jury. Abby knew her reasons for welcoming the experience. As of this morning, Ben knew them too. But as yet the tables hadn't been turned. She was still in the dark as to his motives. Now, ... to learn he was a writer, ... She stared at him with growing awareness. Could he, ... Would he, ... Is this bitch gonna write a book about this case? That's bad. I don't think you're allowed to do that. At that moment, the break was declared over and the jurors stood to file back upstairs. Ben? A long forefinger touched his lips. Okay, I thought he was going to be like, shh, babe, don't worry about it. But he's doing it to himself. As he signaled her to silence. Later, he murmured, guiding her before him out into the hall toward the stairs. Hopelessly immersed amid the others, Abby had to be satisfied with the quiet promise. Back in the courtroom, David White's put on his first witness. Don't you get the opening arguments of the defense? Are we going straight into the witnesses? I don't know. A woman who testified to having seen the abduction. It had been dusk. She'd been driving home from work when she'd seen a man step smoothly from his parked car and grab the arm of a passing woman. There had been an argument, then a tussle. The man had finally pulled the woman around the car to the driver's side and had forced her in before slipping in himself and driving off. On direct examination, the witness identified photographs of the victim, Greta Robinson. She also described the assailant as a man of the same height, weight, and build as Derek Bradley, but could go no further toward a positive identification since the man she'd observed had been wearing a wool hat and tinted glasses and his parka collar had been turned up to his ears. She admitted to having shrugged off the incident as a domestic feud. Oof. Until she'd seen photographs of the missing woman in the newspaper several days later. Abby listened intently to the testimony. One question at a time was asked of the witness, as, only the simplest answer was allowed. It was a slow and painstaking process, but the state's attorney was determined to do it right. Good. Under cross-examination by defense counsel, the witness was treated less kindly. Was she sure there had been an argument? How could she tell if her car was several lengths away and her windows rolled up against the February chill? Did she actually hear anything? Did the alleged victim struggle as she was being led to the driver's side of the car? What did the struggle entail? It had been dusk. Could she be sure that she'd identified the victim correctly? And the defendant, how could she discern his build through his parka? What color had his parka been? Could she be sure that it was Derek Bradley she'd seen? Could she be absolutely sure? The tone of the session had risen in pitch with the defense's cross-examination. If David White's was generally soft-spoken, William Montgomery was his fiery counterpart. By the time the witness had been dismissed and the court recessed for lunch, Abby had had a taste of the challenge she and her fellow jurors faced. As she'd only suspected earlier, the facts that seemed crystal clear one minute were easily clouded the next with the introduction of a second side, a second point of view. Despite oaths to tell the whole truth and nothing but, there were any number of different perceptions and interpretations of the truth. This was what the jurors would have to wade through before their own ordeal was over. If Abby had hoped to gain courage from Ben during the 90-minute lunch break, she was to be disappointed, for he was somehow separated from her during the walk downstairs, and she found herself eating lunch with Patsy and Louise. All three were subdued, as indeed were the others. With the morning's testimony fresh in their minds, there was much to consider and little to discuss. The meal was brought into the jury room and was a soup and sandwich to-go affair that would set precedent for the days ahead. The room itself, the same one in which Abby had sat yesterday, the same one to which the jury had been brought first thing this morning, the same one in which their break had been held earlier, was T-shaped with straight wooden chairs side to side lining every wall, and a large central table on which the food was set. "Thank heavens the chairs upstairs are more comfortable," Patsy murmured as she tried to balance her lunch on her lap while squirming to get comfortable. Abby grimaced. "I'll second that, but it looks like we'll be spending plenty of time down here, too." "Do they always take so many breaks?" Louise leaned forward, her voice a whisper. "They wouldn't want us to go hungry, would they? After all, the show's being put on for our benefit." Relieved that there seemed no bitterness in Louise's quip, Abby smiled. "I hadn't quite thought of it that way before, but you've got a point. When it comes right down to it, each lawyer will try to do his best to sway us to his way of thinking." "And the facts?" Louise interjected more grimly. "Shouldn't they be able to speak for themselves?" "I'm sure they do sometimes," Abby reasoned aloud. "Still, when the facts are hazy..." Her voice trailed off as she verged on the forbidden. The others understood. "Humph," Patsy grunted, but good-naturedly this time. "I'd cast my vote for whoever can do something about these chairs." "Oh, this is..." Abby smiled. "It's because you're so slim, Patsy," she teased. "Now if you had a little more padding in certain spots..." "Look who's talking," the blonde quipped. I mean, I guess at least it's not like fat shaming, but I don't think we need to go there. This is how women bond. You're both crazy, Louise said as she took a large bite of her sandwich, but Abby was sure she had seen the beginnings of a smile, and she was satisfied. What like a choice to come to jury duty to make friends. Between bits and snatches of light conversation, she found herself relaxing more. By the time she'd finished eating, the morning events seemed safely put in perspective. Unfortunately, though, with this gradual release came a renewed awareness of Ben, who sat at the far end of the room engrossed in quiet discussion with one of the other men. There were so many questions she suddenly wanted to ask about his work, his travels, his aspirations. What was it that drew them together? Sheer diversion? The buds of true friendship? The buds of true friendship? Or ... Or ... Was it that same something that made her tremble as she recalled how he'd been that morning, all tousled and sweaty and breathtakingly masculine? Blah. I think we can call that the primal attraction stuff. When she could take no more of her self-induced torment, she stood and turned her back to stare out the window. The leaves had already begun to turn and would be reaching their peak during the next few weeks. Autumn had always been one of her favorite seasons. One of her 4 favorite seasons. A time for coming in and bundling up and setting the first of the logs ablaze in the fireplace. What would that be like? I live in Texas. It's high here. Even now she could smell the fragrance of dry birch and pine. There was nothing more romantic. ... Because it's at the end of the sentence. If you do an ellipses at the end of the sentence, you need to have an additional period to indicate the end of the sentence. See, we're all learning. Penny for your thoughts. Abby looked quickly up at Ben's warm features, then returned to the less dangerous sight of the green beyond the courthouse. I was just thinking about fall. It's a beautiful season. That it is. Football, chestnuts, the smell of burning leaves. Okay. He inhaled deeply. I don't know, though. It smells different this year. Sweeter. More sophisticated? What makes something a sophisticated smell? Abby gave him a gentle nudge in the ribs. That's my perfume, she chided. Listen, don't wear perfume when you're going to be stuck seated in 2 rows very close to 11 other people, 12 other people, 13 other people, because there's 14, no. I'm right, it's 11, no. They have 14 people on this jury because they have the 12 and then 2 alternates. But Ben is number 13, and he's sitting with her. So they have the alternates in with them because obviously it makes sense for the alternates to be like in there already. Otherwise, you'd have to like re-explain the whole case to them. That's not the point. The point is that perfume can give people headaches. So, like, maybe consider that when you're trapped in the same room with people. Okay, she's talking about her perfume, but caught her breath when she felt his lips by her ear. Ooh, personal space, buddy. I was wondering what was driving me crazy all morning. Blech. You did it on purpose, didn't you? Ugh. Who? ... Me? But I always wear it. ... Then I'm in big trouble. He lengthened the big for emphasis. She shrugged. You seem to find the perfect solution just now. All you have to do is stay on the far side of the room. You missed me, he said softly, and she knew she had to do something to redirect his thoughts. Actually, she began, turning to lean back on the windowsill and face him, I was looking forward to hearing about this book you're going to write. Which one? At his look of utter innocence, she sighed. The one about the jury process. Ah, that one. She waited, But he said nothing more. Come on, Ben. That is one of the side benefits to serving on this jury, isn't it? He raised a speculative brow, then let it fall. Perhaps. You mean to say you haven't already begun to do research? Wasn't that what mixing last night at dinner was about? And lunch just now? A spark of silver flashed in his eyes. I guess he has gray eyes. Listen, I can't take it if it's also a supernatural jury romance. Unless you're going to tell me that at the beginning, because, like, a supernatural jury romance where you're like, hey, we're dealing with werewolves and vampires and stuff. That would be kind of cool. You did miss me. I think you're jealous. He seemed eminently pleased at the possibility. Jealous? She asked, swallowing hard. Not on your life, she lied. That's like 3 times she said not on your life. I'd just like to know what's for the sake of research and what's for real. Until she'd said it, she hadn't quite thought of it that way, but it was the truth. There was a tiny part of her that feared she was part of his study, and the thought hurt. Ben's eyes held hers, reading her emotions in hopefully a totally normal way. When he raised his hand to her cheek, here we go again with the cheek touches, his touch held only tenderness. Again, she felt it, that same something that surged between them each time they were together. She could almost forget where they were, that there were others around, that they'd soon be returning to the courtroom. She could almost forget. ... Almost. ... But not quite. Ben, Abby, Grace broke into their mind lock as gently as possible. They'd like us back upstairs now. Slowly dropping his hand, Ben took a deep breath and straightened. Later, Abby, later, he murmured, as he stood back to let her pass. We have 12 pages of this chapter left. I think we can do it. We'll see. Abby pondered his words as she lay on her bed late that afternoon. Later, when would that be? And what would happen then? More critically, what did she want to happen? But just as courtroom issues were shady at points, so the question she asked herself had no easy answer. On the one hand, she wanted Ben to tell her of his thoughts, to reassure her that the spark between them was real, to kiss her and hold her in proof of its existence. On the other hand, she wanted him to say nothing further, to be as detached and self-contained as the other jurors appeared to be. For one fact simply couldn't be denied. She and Ben were members of a jury impaneled to make an important decision in the days ahead. The thought of a love affair in the process was preposterous. Or is it? It was a war between emotion and reason with no truth in sight. Shifting restlessly, she looked toward the wall. His wall. What was he doing now? Thinking, wearing? What was he doing, thinking, wearing now? I don't know, that's sort of a weird sentence. Would he really write a book on his experience as a juror? Are you allowed to do that? And who had he spoken to last night on the phone just before she'd received her call from Sean? Bolting upright in self-reproach, she threw herself into the chair, snatched up a notebook and pen, and began to record what had happened in court that day. It was something she'd decided to do when she'd first been impaneled, something she felt might make the restriction the judge had imposed on discussion of the trial easier to bear. True, it was a personal outlet of sorts, but having passed a full day in court, she saw another benefit. Given the abundance of details introduced into evidence, her notes might well be of help to her when the time for deliberations arrived. Writing quickly, she recreated the events of the morning, then moved on. The afternoon session had commanded concentration as intense as had the morning session. This time, the witness had been the police officer who had tracked down and finally rescued Greta Robinson. The testimony had been tedious, laced with dates and times and locations. There had been a missing persons report and a subsequent search, then the appearance of the witness who claimed to have seen the abduction. There had been lead upon lead, one falling flat on the next, until a pair of hikers had returned from a wooded area far north with reports of a locked cabin and a woman's cry from within. I wonder if I can find a ferret. He wants to go. Well, goodbye. A soft knock on the door made her jump. Catching her breath, she laid her pen and paper on the table and went to answer it. On the other side stood Ben, wearing a plaid shirt, jeans, and sneakers, looking handsome enough to shake her breathing all the more. "You weren't sleeping?" he asked by way of apology. That's not. I'm trying to figure out how that's an apology. By way of apology, so that instead of an apology? Only then taking in her own sweater and jeans. No, she offered with a wave toward the table. "I was just making some notes for myself, but I could use the break. Things get very dramatic, even in hindsight." "I know what you mean." He hesitated. "How about a walk?" Was this the later he'd promised? "Can we?" she asked, her eyes alight. "I mean, are we allowed out, on our own?" Blech. For some reason, she felt foolishly young just then. She couldn't decide whether it was the need to get permission to go out or her giddiness at the thought of going out with Ben. "I've checked with the desk, and they say we're allowed to walk by ourselves, as long as we stay within sight of the inn." It's presumptuous of you to check already, but hey. Both recalled the morning's run when they'd ventured much farther than that. Ray had been with them then. Now, though, neither of them particularly wanted his company. Yeah. Don't want to be third-wheeling that conversation. "Sounds fine." She turned toward the closet. "Just let me get something for my feet." Kneeling, she retrieved her sneakers and sank into the chair to put them on. Ben had stepped forward to lean against the door jamb. "Your room's very much like mine," he observed as his eyes skirted it. "Different colors, perhaps, different artwork. And of course," he pushed himself from the jamb and walked toward the dresser. "There isn't a bottle of perfume in sight." Abby watched as he lifted the decorative bottle, unscrewed its cap, and inhaled deeply. Ugh. Then, as deliberately, he set it down and turned to her, his mien suddenly more alert, his features tauter. That's like his manner, is his mien. His eyes told the story, though, warm to the point of smoldering. Ooh, smolder. At a strange loss for words, she snapped back to tying her laces. "Honey..." When her fingers stumbled, she had to start again. The simple process seemed to take forever. When she straightened, Ben was directly before her. "Don't look at me that way," she half teased, but her voice was shaky. "I didn't tell you to walk in and smell the stuff." "But you're sitting there so damn appealing." Blech, he said in a tone that held its share of accusation. "She's just sitting there. Okay, dude? Mind your business." Reaching down, he drew her up. She's already standing. Because we did this in the last chapter too, where like they straighten and then they stand up. So I guess you're just like sitting up and then standing up. She couldn't have thought to resist the gentle strength of his arms. It seemed that she'd wanted to touch him. Oh, wait. I missed a pronoun in there. It seemed that she'd wanted him to touch her all along. Her eyes met his. I can see words super good. Her eyes met his, and once more she felt that same silent force. She tried to remind herself of the time and place, that they were two people thrown together for an intensive 3-week trial, but nothing could cool the heat she felt radiating from him into her and back. Pow, pow, pow. Slowly, he lifted his hands to frame her face. Oh boy. His fingers wove into her hair, savoring its dark luxuriance. His thumbs lightly explored her lips before falling back to clear the way. So he's got like his hands on her face and he's like, bleh. Abby heard the catch in his breath, felt its warmth against her mouth, yet he held back, not quite kissing her, sampling the excitement to be gained from the waiting. So I guess his face is just like really close to hers. His hands are on the side of her face. Breathing in her space. Yikes. She'd never known such sweet anticipation. Of course, it was as though they had all the time in the world to enjoy the small pleasures of life. I thought you were going to go for a walk. Perhaps it was a situation. Perhaps the thought of pain between man and woman, the trial's main concern, had given them a greater appreciation of something each had taken for granted before. She didn't know for sure, but she surrendered to the pure delight she felt as he grazed her cheeks, her chin, the tip of her nose. It was only when her lips parted in warm invitation that he finally gave in to his own ardent need. His kiss was full and rich, as heady as any wine she'd ever drunk. It seemed to consume her, to draw her into him, just as his gaze could always do. Weak in the knees, Abby clung to him, unaware that she'd touched him until her arms met each other at the nape of his neck. Okay. Do you ever just read like a romance novel and the whole time you're trying to figure out what exactly their bodies are doing? Like I said before, I'm not necessarily the intended audience for romance novels. She moaned against his mouth when she felt him complete the embrace. Oh, Abby, ... Abby, ... Tearing his lips from hers, he crushed her against him. Hugs. Why here, ... Why now, he rasped against her hair. But she had no answer to the anguish in his voice, nor did she fully understand it. It's because he's planning to murder everybody in this hotel. And she was too overwhelmed by her own emotions to do much more than tremble silently against him. You okay? Seems like a lot for just some kissing, but here we are. Gradually, the ragged tempo of his heartbeat eased, and she felt his tautness relax. Only then was she able to look up at him. What happened to that walk? She whispered hoarsely, her own pulse still erratic. Ben cleared his throat. Good thinking. That walk. In a deliberate motion, he set her back, then raked his hands through his hair, looked down at the rug, and frowned. Look, Abby. No, Ben, she began, holding up a hand for his silence. Please don't say anything. Some tiny part of her wasn't sure she wanted his apology. How do you know he was going to apologize? That would imply he was sorry he'd kissed her, and she wasn't. But he was determined. His fingers grasped her shoulders with a strange fierceness. Okay. That shouldn't have happened, not with what we've got ahead of us. But damn it, I've wanted to kiss you since I first saw you yesterday. Stunned by his begrudging admission and the force behind it, she stared mutely up at him. Then she realized the truth of his words. His was the voice of reason, the small voice she'd ignored within herself. But he was right. Their timing was wrong. But, Lord help her, she wanted him to kiss her again. Look, he growled. I think I've read too many supernatural romance books, which is like 3. I think that's too many. Look, he growled. Maybe we'd better forget that walk. No, she exclaimed, then managed to lower her voice. I do need a break. Fresh air. Something. If I sit here until dinner, I'll only rehash the day in court, and I've got to get away from it. It was only half the truth. If she sat there alone now, she'd also rehash the feelings she'd experienced in Ben's arms, but he didn't want to hear that. Yeah, going on a walk is definitely going to help you with that, babe. Dropping his hands from her shoulders, he stepped back. Then he rubbed the muscles at the back of his neck. You're not the only one. Okay, let's go. They walked in silence down 2 flights of stairs through the large foyer and out. Though the sun's shadows were lengthening by the minute, the day was far from gone. Abby stood for a minute in the path of one golden streak, turning her face to its source and breathed in deeply. It felt good to be outside. She should have done this the minute she'd returned. The air was invigorating, the sun's rays warm. Relaxation was fully within her grasp. Abby. Opening her eyes, she saw Ben staring at her. Sorry, she murmured and trotted down the last step. Let her sun bathe, dude. Then, following his lead, she matched her stride to his. With the crisp grass of autumn whispering beneath their shoes, they slowly made a broad circle around the inn, finally coming to rest side by side against the base of an ancient oak. It was Ben who spoke first. What were you writing when I interrupted you? She told you, right? She said I was rehashing what, blah, blah, kissing. She was making some notes for myself. That's what she said. She said I was making some notes for myself, so he knows this. Maybe. Sorry. He asked, leaning back against the ridged bark and gazing lazily toward the leaves above. She pulled at a blade of grass and fingered it idly. I was writing down what went on. So sorry. I was writing down what went on today. You know, witnesses and facts and dates and all. This was only the first day, and there's so much to remember. What's going to happen after 10 or 12 days of testimony? He chuckled. We'll either be very confused or totally convinced. I suppose you're right, she mused, but still, I feel better making notes at the end of each day. And since we can't discuss the case with anyone, I suppose it's like a diary. You sound like you should be the one writing a book. She looked up to find him watching her closely. Tell me about it, Ben. I think it's a fascinating idea. You may think so, but I'm not sure the others would agree if they knew what I was doing. She recalled her comment about differentiating between research and reality. They don't have to know now, do they? For the first time since he'd arrived at her room, Ben smiled. Then I can count on you to keep my secret? Of course you can. She turned to face him head-on. Did you really think I'd tell them to watch their words when you're around? She laughed softly. I'm more curious to see if you can get them to open up, even without their knowing your ulterior motive. Are you writing specifically about this case or about jury duty as a whole? Give me some actual details, my dude. Oh, I'll get them talking. You seem very sure. It's the circumstances, Abby. There's an initial wariness they feel toward each other, toward the trial itself. As time goes on, they'll open up to satisfy a very basic human need, if nothing else. She reflected for a minute on the basic human need she felt and frowned in puzzlement. It was a basic feminine need where Ben was concerned. I mean... But why now? Why here? Then she caught her breath as she realized she echoed the questions he'd asked earlier. Right when he was, full of regret. Tell me about yourself, Abby, he asked now. He'd caught her at the moment she was vulnerable, when the door to her soul had been open. Looking away to hide her confusion, she shrugged. What would you like to know? How long have you lived here? 3 years. I moved up from New York. Ah, the big city. Bourbon and water. That's right. What were you doing there? I worked in the pediatric ward of a hospital. I'm just saying that I'm pretty sure he knows Sean. You must love children. Yes. But you don't have your own. Nope. Aside from not having married, any other reason? Resting her head back against the tree, she grew more reflective. I've got time. I'm just not ready for either marriage or children. When the time is right, I'll know it. What about your fiancé? She shot him a fast glance. He's not my fiancé. Then what? You must have some sort of relationship with him for him to call on the phone and announce himself that way. He's my boss. Yikes, honey. Your boss? You're carrying on an affair with your boss? That's also how I feel about it, Ben. Not quite, she drawled. Then she studied his dark expression and grinned. If I didn't know better, I'd say you were jealous. It's not cute to be jealous. It's not. Damned right I am, he admitted without hesitation. Blech, it's not cute. You're a beautiful woman, Abby. As his tone grew more husky, she felt her own response. But before it could swell to anything more than a gentle tremor in her limbs, she wrenched her gaze from him and looked off toward the garden house. It seemed unfair that Ben should be able to excite her with no more than a word, a tone, a glance. She'd never felt this deep stirring for Sean. Had she ever felt it before, or had the fat of sequestration, a kind of contrived captivity in itself, done something to her senses? I'm not liking, the comparison between the case that they're doing, which is hey, a man held a woman captive in a cabin for 3 weeks, or however many weeks, with, hey, our romance is happening in a captive place for 3 weeks. Don't like that for us. You never told me how the college is managing without you for these 3 weeks, she said, drawing on one of the many questions in her mind in an attempt to bank the fire. Hasn't the semester just begun? Ben indulged her momentarily. Jury duty is high priority stuff. My colleagues will cover for me. Particularly if a book is forthcoming from the experience? He didn't answer, simply studied her. Then his indulgence ended. Okay. What? He shouldn't be, indulging you to answer your questions. Like it's something he's doing as a favor instead of, having a conversation with you. Because obviously what matters is what he wants to talk about. Why would your boss call himself your fiancé? Uh-oh, we're back to that again? Why not? I have an interesting theory. I don't care about your theories. He looked toward the horizon and gestured where headlines might be. Beautiful young nurse chased around examining room by Dr. Madley and passionately in love with her. It's a little wordy, Ben. It needs to be shorter and snappier if you're going to do a headline. That's absurd, Ben. Sean doesn't chase me. Not in the most ludicrous sense, at least. Do you date him? Yes. He's a nice guy. A nice guy? That's a poison for passion if there ever was one. He paused. But is it true? Is what true? That he's in love with you. She shrugged. He says he is. And you're stringing him along. Yeah, she sure is. Abby looked up at him sharply. I wouldn't say that, but you are, babe. I've told him over and over again that I'm not in love with him and that I won't marry him. I don't exactly call that stringing him along. But you'll go on dates with him? He's your boss, Abby. But the poor guy may be suffering. I don't care if he's suffering. That's not my fault, she exclaimed with growing indignation. How much more blunt can I be? Or do you suggest that I agree to marry him? She snapped her fingers. Just like that. Unfazed by her show of irritation, Ben delved further. He's a doctor, isn't he? You could do worse, he stated with a calmness that irked her all the more. Abby's spine stiffened. I don't believe you, Ben. You sound like my mother. Maybe she has a point. Why are you arguing about this? She's not the one being pushed into marriage. If I don't love Sean, I won't marry him. My lord, the divorce rate is high enough. But surely there would be something in it for you, even without love. Security, kids, sex. Fully incensed now, she scrambled to her feet and stood before him with her hands on her hips. It so happens that I have security. I have a good job. And a trust fund left by my father, trust fund baby. Furthermore, she gulped, I have kids, dozens and dozens of them, all of whom I can send home at the end of the day, which is the best way to have kids. And as for sex, she raged, as for sex, Sean Hennessy just doesn't turn me on. Besides, she added on a note of spite, these are modern times. If a woman needs a bedmate, she takes one, with or without a wedding band. Yeah, good for you. It's the 80s. Her hair flew out behind as she whirled on her heel and headed for the inn. Her blood pounded in her ears. Her chest heaved. She'd never been as irate in her life. Irate, hurt, disappointed. Storming at the front steps, she was filled with dismay that Ben could have said what he said. What he had. Security, kids, sex, bah! Typically masculine point of view. No love, never love. Was it exclusively a woman's emotion? Oh boy. True, Sean believed he loved her, but he too seemed to feel that a marriage could survive without that one element. And what had his love consisted of? He said she was bright, hardworking, and wonderful with kids. The perfect little wife and mother, she fumed as she slammed through the front door and attacked the stairs at a jogger's pace. But Sean had never pushed her physically. Good. That's good. Now she'd wondered why. That's because he's respecting your boundaries? That can't be it. Oh, he'd kissed her and crooned sexy thoughts to her. Everyone's psychic for some reason. They'd even indulged in a little petting. But when Abby pulled back, he never complained. Did he too feel that something was missing? Or maybe he's respecting your choices. I can't believe I'm rooting for Sean. No, I'm not. He was extremely pushy earlier. Very controlling. And announced himself as her fiance when that's not what she wants. But, did he too feel that something was missing? Was he reluctant, finally, to accept the fact that the chemistry was all wrong? His chemistry is all that matters. Rounding one flight and loping up the next, she reran Ben's words. Security. She had it. Kids. Perhaps there was more to the issue there. It was one thing to find pleasure in other people's children, quite another to experience the joys of one's own. She wasn't blind to her deep maternal instincts, nor did she doubt that one day she would want a child. But motherhood was no reason to rush into marriage with Sean, particularly when something deep within her told her she could have had it all. Particularly when something deep within told her she could have it all. And the sex, the big S. First and foremost on every man's mind. With an angry scowl and a low muttered oath, she slammed the door of her room and leaned back against it. There, too, she'd only told half the story. Modern women were freer than ever in satisfying their own desires, and she hadn't reached the age of 28 a virgin, but she demanded something beyond the purely physical, something to give meaning to those joys of the flesh, not marriage nor promises. Not marriage nor promises, she mused, but love. Very simply, love. Nothing wrong with that. That's the end of chapter 3, actually. That was fine. For a brief moment there, I phased into a reality where I liked Sean as a partner. It's fine though. I remembered myself and came back. Well, we are getting some stuff for the jury trial, so that's interesting. Also, I had let the ferrets out in the hopes that they would wander around and keep me company. And they wandered right back and put themselves back to bed. Because it's the middle of the day and they sleep 20 hours a day. Bless their little mustelid hearts. Okay. Thank you for joining me for chapter 3 of An Irresistible Impulse. I guess I'll see you next time.